Hi, Assalamualaikum and good morning everyone. We are from group 2. We are going to represent a history of women's writing. There are 5 of us. My name is Jasmine and then there's Aqeelah, Alia, Eva and Belle. Ta-da! Alright, so we are going to start with the introduction and then a turn to women's writing, a women's literary tradition, towards a black and lesbian feminist criticism, subverting the law of the father, women's writing as a history of women's writing. Eva?
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, feminist literary criticism began to emerge in the late 60s and early 70s. And it became prominent with the publication of provocative and influential texts by Kate Millett, Sexual Politics, Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, and Eva Figg's Patriarchal Attitudes. These pioneering polemics gave less attention to women's writing as they were almost solely concerned with men. Jane Austen and George Eliot's works and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights were regarded well by levists. However, other well-known women writers such as Charlotte and Anne Bronte, Virginia Woolf, and Mary Shelley's works were heavily criticized. So for the focus of this chapter, it mainly focused about the gradual rediscovery and re-evaluation of women's writing by feminist literary critics during the 2 decades following the explosion of feminist protests. The new wave of feminist critiques attack patriarchal attitudes, cultural misogyny, and the ingrained belittlement of women, which was summed up by the title of Eva Figg's Patriarchal Attitudes. And the second wave of feminism came to be out of a period of social protest modeled on and aligned with other campaigning groups of the 60s. For example, in the States, emergence of feminists was due to the significant role of the civil rights movement, which alerted women to their own lack of rights. Kate Millett critiqued women authors such as Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and Charlotte Bronte and their works with dismissive misogynist views. Though Millett did conclude that Charlotte Bronte's Villette is interesting, revolutionary, and have its importance after heavily criticizing the work. Her Sexual Politics was a provocative and brief attack on contemporary attitudes to the relations between men and women. Eva Figg's book, on the other hand, Patriarchal Attitudes, though more sober, is still written with incisiveness, which analyzes the Western attitudes to women over the century. In Britain, women's movement was also modeled and initiated due to the refusal to accept white supremacy. The women's liberation movement consciously named itself almost similar to the anti-colonial national liberation movements around the world. Juliet Mitchell, for example, was deeply involved in the New Left and its support for these nationalistic and anti-imperialist struggles. These movements, according to Mitchell, could serve as a model of resistance. Article Woman, the Longest Revolution, which was published in 1966, was the opening salvo of the new British women's movement, and it appeared in the New Left Review and managed to stimulate the purpose of these anti-colonial movements. It is important to note that the second wave feminists were predominantly white and middle class, and the uncertainty of such comparisons with oppressed races later became an issue. Nonetheless, it was because of such revolutionary protests that second wave feminism emerged. The 60s was a decade where traditional hierarchies were being challenged to a vast extent. The attitudes to class, race, social authority, and colonial dominance were the subjects of critique and re-examination. Philosophy thinkers like Derrida, who questioned the whole foundation of Western metaphysics, which later he called white mythology, were making their first impact on the English-speaking world, and by the end of the decade, gender was given attention as well. For Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch sums up the new movement by contrasting second wave feminism with the suffragette movement. And if you guys want to refer to the excerpt, you can go to page 122. Nevertheless, Greer's attacks were still belittling women's work, much as Millett did. Mary Ellman's critique of the misogynistic stereotypes is the only work of American feminist criticism that received praise from Toriel Moy. Ellman wrote more about women writers than Millett, Greer, and Figg, but she too criticizes women writers for accepting and reproducing stereotypes of women similar to what men have been writing, as if participating in their own oppression. I will pass the floor to Jasmine.
Thank you, Eva. Hi, I will be presenting about the turn to women's writing. So the turn to women's writing. During the 1960s, a major difference in women's writing can be seen by the women authors who had already questioned the women's roles and male-female relationships. So these are the books written in the 60s. The turn to women's writing in the 60s are mainly focused on issues that are about colonialism, race, class, political oppression, and mental illness. Doris Lessing, her book is The Golden Notebook, 1962, Children of Violence, Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar, and Ariel in the 1960s as well. Jean Rees, White Sargasso Sea, 1966, and Angela Carter, The Magic Toy Shop, 1967, Heroes and Villains, 1969. Women that also published their writings in the 60s, other than the ones I have shown you in the previous slide, is Margaret Drabble, A.S. Byatt, or her full name is Dame Antonia Susan Byatt, Edna O'Brien, Nadine Gordimer, Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark, and Mary McCarthy. The first three women, Margaret Drabble, A.S. Byatt, and Edna O'Brien, are one of the first writers who published their book in the 60s. They brought their first novels in the 50s. And then Nadine Gordimer, Iris Murdoch, and Muriel Sparks, they have been writing since the 50s, and also Mary McCarthy, who has been writing since the 40s and published her book regularly. Justified in 1973 by Margaret Drabble, large amount of fictional writing written by women for the last decade are the women who witness, women who shares the same worries and turn to fiction to express their feelings. Previously, women faced a lot of difficulties to express themselves, but since the 60s, women writers started to write about the same worries, anxieties, issues that they face, the women face in the past, so that women readers can recognize what happened between and to the woman from the earlier of times. For 1970s writing, the women writings have developed from attacking patriarchy to the task that Greer had urged them, which is liberating themselves. Women's writing, both contemporary and from the past, that would be increasingly drawn upon to interpret and articulate feminist women's concerns. Flora Kaplan's triangular shape of the relationships include development of a feminist criticism, feminism as a social movement, women's writing, creative space, and new renaissance of women's writing. According to Kaplan, in the 70s, everyone read poetry and novels when they came out, which the text was controversial compared to the feminist movement. Kaplan was referring to a specific book entitled Consciously as a Feminist Writers by Marge Piercy, Margaret Atwood, Michelle Roberts, Erica Jong, Marilyn French, Zoe, Valerie Meiner, Pat Barker. And then when feminist literary critics first began to turn their attention to women's writing, it was either general or focused on the 19th century novel, as with more recent writing. Publishing houses that existed during the 1960s, 1970s is Virago in United Kingdom, The Woman's Press, United Kingdom, Pandora, United Kingdom, Feminist Press in the United States. Publishers that specialize in women's writing, which Showalter described as gynocriticism, as they focus more on literature by women, emerged as a ground-up movement. The engagement with and the excitement over women's writing was already there. Differences of second-wave feminism in America and Britain. In the States, the feminist theory was discovered much earlier in academic institutions. Sexual Politics, as Kate Millett's books for her PhD thesis, she used that book. Then in Britain, the higher education was more conservative, so feminism took longer time to enter their higher education. And meanwhile, in the 70s, feminism flourished outside of higher education through women's social group, as where it was closely associated with the left and involved in direct social and political action. So the group began to study women's history. Feminist historians like Sheila Robotham, Sally Alexander, and Barbara Taylor, where they learn courses that are more radical than the university's courses. Robotham published Woman, Resistance and Revolution in 1972 and Hidden from History, 300 Years of Women's Oppression and the Struggle Against It in 1973. She offers a different perspective on women and than Millet's and Gray's early works, which they belittle women's work, and one that would fit into a feminist literary criticism.
Okay, hi everyone. I will be continuing the presentation with the subtopic of a woman's literary tradition. Okay, so it was never said or implied by any feminist critics that women were talentless when it came to writing. They only lacked the opportunities such as economic independencies, lack of status, lack of time, lack of money, and as we have learned in from Virginia Woolf, A Rooms of One's Own, women who want to write freely must have the luxury of time and space, which was quite hard to obtain at the time, thus deprives women from literature. However, despite the lack of opportunities, women still managed to achieve a lot in this field, which if we think about it, if women had the same opportunities as men, there would definitely be a lot more amazing women writers out there. So feminist studies of women's writing started in 1970s that focuses on the 19th century writings. And one of the first works that came out was The Female Imagination by Patricia Mayer Spacks in 1975. So Spacks started the book by regarding Virginia Woolf as one of the first few female theorists that concerned themselves with women's literary manifestations. However, she still sees some female self-doubt in her predecessors, but is more positive on other women's writers that she discusses in the book. She also states that in every literature period, a special female self-awareness emerges, despite the unstable social conditions that might affect the opportunities for women. However, this claim is not as strong as the claim as she mostly studies books that were written by white middle-class women in the Anglo-American tradition. Nonetheless, her lively and sympathetic yet engaging discussion of women writers have definitely become the foundation for feminist literary criticism to develop in the future. Okay, moving on to the next book, which is Ellen Moore's Literary Women, that clearly proclaims the achievement of women's writers. In the 18th century, women's writers became a sign of modernity through the amazing works that they have written and contributed in this field over a long stretch of time. English, American, and French women writers from the 18th to the early 20th century, such as Emily Dickinson and the Bronte sisters, and many more, were compared to male authors. Many famous female Gothic works, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, that was neglected at the time, was also included in the book. Lastly, A Literature of Their Own, written by Elaine Showalter's 1977, introduced a bigger range of writers who were not as popular, such as Mary Braddon, George Egerton, and etc. She didn't really see women writers as a movement and argues that each generation of women writers found themselves. However, she does believe that female literary tradition exists and follow the same pattern of development, which are the three-stage trajectory, which is the imitation, the critique, and lastly, the self-discovery as other literary subcultures.
Okay, so in this slide, we will be talking about Towards a Black and Lesbian Feminist Criticism. So after Spacks, Moore's, and Showalter's groundbreaking work, disputes soon arise. So we will be looking at Barbara Smith's Towards a Black Feminist Criticism article. So in the article, she attacked Spacks and Moore's as well as Showalter's 1975 article. She raised the question towards feminist critics about why could they uncover dozens of truly obscure white women writers? Could they not take Black women writers seriously? In the article, Smith also points out that Spacks was teaching at Wellesley the same time as Alice Walker was there, taking one of the first classes in the States on Black women writers. She then rebukes Showalter's mindset of thinking that the identities of being Black and female are mutually exclusive, meaning that if you are Black, and you cannot be both. You are either Black or a female. Yeah. Smith also criticized Showalter's audacity to mention the usage of Black literature. She used the wide term Black American novelist in her 1975 article, and Smith claims that it is a form of poorly disguised cultural imperialism, and the excerpt can be referred in page 128. So these charges against white feminists was revisited in Bell Hooks's Ain't I a Woman 1981, which again raised the issue of critics' tendency to equate white women's oppression with the blacks without thinking about the position it left black women. So a collection of black feminist criticism published in 1982 entitled All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave readily sums up the raised issue against white feminists. Millet in her postscript had used similar comparisons in her sexual politics. For her, this was a radical vision, but for her black critics, it was ignoring the realities of their very different experiences of oppression as black women. And here I would like to add that not only black women were oppressed because of their race, they were also oppressed because of their gender. This is like double the oppression. By the late 70s, many striking writings by non-white emerged in the USA. These writings were produced by Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, Maya Angelou, Paul Marshall, and Alice Walker for African Americans. And then we have Asian American Maxine Hong Kingston, and then we have Native American Leslie Marmon Silko. The Women's Press in Britain, which was founded a year after Smith's article, built up by Rosedale Lane Roll, a South African who was involved in opposition to apartheid. From the beginning, they had a policy of publishing work by Black and what were then referred to as third world writers. The significance of Black women's writing in the new wave of females' creativity was widely acknowledged by the time Alice Walker's The Color Purple won the Pulitzer Prize in 1983. Okay, and then we will be moving on with the lesbian critics who contributed to the broadening of both the range of interest in women's writing and its interpretation. We have Bonnie Zimmerman, who critiqued the heterosexism of what were already being seen as mainstream feminist critiques. She draws attention to the disregarded lesbianism of writers like Woolf or Steen whenever they are being discussed. Adrienne Rich, on the other hand, published her famous article Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence in 1980, which talks of a lesbian continuum of women who want to define themselves without reference to men. So in her work, she cites H.G. Wolff, Emil Dickinson, and Charlotte Bronte, also adding African-American writers Lauren Hansberry, Zora Neale Hurston, and Toni Morrison's Sula. The mention of those three Black writers previously significant because Zimmerman acknowledged in an article published in 1981 that American lesbian criticism, like American feminism in general, was often seen by Black feminists as racist, though it had in fact been much influenced by Black lesbian critics. So Rich's references show that she recognizes the necessity of acknowledging the contribution of African American women writers. She wants to argue for the alliance of lesbian and feminist critical efforts and for the shared concerns of white and Black women. Unfortunately, Rich was attacked by Hooks for her idealization of white women's sympathy for Black. I will pass the floor to Belle.
Okay, next we will look into the subverting the law of the father in history of women's writing. Okay, in this section, we will focus on the 70s and early 80s feminist writing tenets. Okay, first and foremost, we need to understand what is the law of the father in this context. So the law of the father is a psychoanalytic term by Jacques Lacan, in which he argues children enters into the already patriarchal culture. Lacan's work has been interpreted as a justification for patriarchal social relationship, and French feminists especially has developed and utilized this notion. Okay, there has been a phase transition from the 60s revolution to the 80s Reaganite and Thatcherite. This includes the advancement in terms of technology, political. So this equals to the growth of women's movement. So feminist views of women's literature reflected the sense of the struggle during the growth of the women's movement. One of the most highly influential texts during that time is The Mad Woman on the Attic by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. The text consists of a heroic tale of women's writer fights for self-creation against a very powerful patriarchal authority. Both Gilbert and Gubar highlights the challenges in a Victorian patriarchal society, the impact family dynamics had on their writing, and also emphasize the theme of imprisonment and escape in their work as a reflection of the confinement women experienced in the Victorian time. Okay, so there are two dominant metaphors in their text, which is escape and enclosure in women's writer. So this is in connection to self-creation. However, there were people who pointed out that they paint a very terrifying picture of homogeneous patriarchal that makes it hard to believe that the subversive strategy of liberation that this woman writer used were even possible. And Gilbert and Gubar's struggle in feministic theories was with the oppressive phallic weight of a male literary tradition. This includes how Lacan's notion of the symbolic order as the law of the father gain attention. And then in this respect, there has been some concern for French feminist theory. Thus, in 1980, Elaine Marx and Isabelle de Courtivron brought out a collection entitled New French Feminism. So for many English speaker feminists, the book was their first introduction to Helene Cizot and Julia Kristeva. In both Britain and the States, were interested in their ideas, particularly in their strategies for subversive writing. Next, okay, so Cizot's notion of écriture féminine is not confined to biological women. The text connected commonly with modernist male writer, which rejects essentialism. So essentialism is when one would argue that women are fundamentally different than men in terms of their fixed attribute, like fixed qualities, like men should be aggressive and women should be caretakers, like that. So this view, especially, very welcome to some feminists. And this text, the effect of this text has gained appreciation and attention to the work of women modernists and avant-garde writers, and also a new interest in textuality, in the oppression of gender and desire within text. So in 1979, Mary Jacobus, influenced by Kristeva and Cizot, she published a collection of essays entitled Woman Writing and Writing About Women. During that time, French feminism had already changed the critical landscape in the academy, both states and Britain. So in 1985, Toria Moy, a Marxist feminist post-structuralist, she published Sexual and Textual Politics. In that text, Moy discussed how traditional Anglo-American feminist criticism, this includes the Black and lesbian critique, is fatally flawed by its naive essentialism. Besides that, Moy also argues that Anglo-American criticism has not really freed itself from the patriarchal assumption of humanism, which is their search for unity and wholeness, and it remains ideologically part of traditional male dominated literary criticism. A collection called Marxist Feminist Literature Collective, which include many well-known critics such as Laura Kaplan, John Redford, Maud Elman, Jacobus, Helen Taylor, and Mish Lebara, they were also interested in Lacan psychoanalysis of the notion of the law of the father, and also French theorists such as Louis Althusser and Pierre Mechery. Lacan's work was originally introduced to Britain through an article by Althusser in the New Left Review in 1969, had been brought into the feminist debate by Juliette Michel, Groundbreaking Psychoanalysis and Feminism in 1974. This collection wanted to explore the issues of class and gender, and they also argued that, quote, because of the subordinate place of women within the ruling class, women's writing both articulate and challenges the dominant ideology from a dissented position within. So by the late 70s, the group was disbanded. In individual, many of them went on to contribute significantly to the development of feminist literary criticism in higher education.
Okay, hi everyone. I will be explaining about a woman's writing as a history of women's writing. So it all started in the 80s, where the reading by the women writers increased rapidly. International Feminist Book Fair, and conferences were first founded and held during this time. And then the contemporary women writers already started discussing about how they can be a writer and how they write their story. And then Micheline Wander, editor of On Gender and Writing, 1983, and Susan Sellers, the editor of Delighting the Heart, a notebook by women writers, 1989, made these books famous during that times across the globe. So during these times also, there were publishers that celebrated the achievement of women writers in many aspects, such as politics, social, economics. The example of publishers are Penguin's Life of Modern Women and Virago's Pioneers. And then it became more interesting because interviews and reviews of the women's writers already appeared in magazines and books. So the example of feminist magazines of the period are MS, Women's Review of Books, Spare Rib, Women's Review, and Every Woman. And then also the non-white writers, such as writers from African American, British Caribbean, or diasporic Asians, start to make their works recognized in the community of reading women. And then in the second half of the 18th, the term post-colonial novel was also introduced in the reading women community as a dispute among them occurred. Okay, and then the unmistakable arrival of feminist literary criticism made by Showalters in his book in 1977 was saved by Edward Said when he indicated the opening up of this other revolutionary field, which is the feminist literary criticism. And this was explained in Edward Said books, which is called Orientalism. Earlier than that, which is in the 70s, British feminists had realized the increasing of the possibility of not consider gender in isolation from issues of class. However, American feminists aware that it was essential to not isolate issues of gender from race way earlier than that. So fortunately, the lesson that was in America, which is not to isolate gender from race, was now being learned also in Britain in the late 80s as how it is crucial in America. So in the early 1980s in Britain, both feminist literary criticism and post-colonial theory are included in the literature department of more radical, the higher education institutions, as had already happened in the States. This feminist literary criticism and post-colonial theory were eagerly seized on by students in both Britain and States. Young women, both black and white, either within the academy or outside the academy, read these works by the writers from various areas, such as from the South African Bessie Head, the Nigerian Buki Emikita, the Maori New Zealander Carrie Holm, and the Caribbean Grace Nichols. And then a feminist critic, Alison Light, remarked that the productiveness of feminist readers had evolved, as well as the vitality and radical potential of women's writings, whatever its political or ideological constraints. And in the late 1980s, the publishing world has firmly established women's writing as an academic topic of study. It's not just a mere topic of study, it's an academic topic of study. So although there are many challenges for women's writing, either in form of threats, which is the political apostasy, or encouragement, which is a welcoming transformation from the community who reads, the history of women's writing had already been uncovered and established in this world because, as Nikki Jara argued, that women's writing had entered the mainstream as early in the 1989. So that is all about a history of women's writing. This is our work cited. And thank you, everyone.